Hi everyone, welcome back to Difference Frames the World, a channel to view the world from a different perspective. Today, we're talking about something that has confused many people, especially in the Chinese-speaking world. Why did Singapore, a tiny city-state with no strategic depth, suddenly decide to comment publicly on the escalating tensions between China and Japan over Taiwan? And it is not just a comment, but Lawrence Wong, the PM of Singapore, actually urges China to set history aside and move forward, while openly saying Southeast Asia supports Japan playing a larger role in regional security. Instead of urging the Japanese PM to retract her provocative remarks over Taiwan, Lawrence Wong wants China to move forward and forgive the Japanese aggressors as Southeast nations do. That one sentence was enough to spark a political firestorm. People immediately asked, who does Singapore think it is? Why is it pointing fingers at China instead of Japan? And most importantly, how does a country this small dare to lecture a superpower? At first glance, it is poor judgment. But when we look deeper, this wasn't accidental at all. What Singapore did was classic Singapore style, a calculated move rooted in fear, survival instinct, and a deeply ingrained belief in great power balancing. The problem is, this time, that calculation may be dangerously wrong. Singapore is not neutral, it never has been. Singapore likes to present itself as neutral, pragmatic, and above ideological fights. But in reality, Singapore has never been neutral in the way Switzerland is neutral. Singapore's diplomacy is built on one core idea: survive by balancing bigger powers against each other. This mindset goes all the way back to independence. Singapore is a city-state without natural resources or strategic depth. It has no hinterland or room for military mistakes. If something goes seriously wrong, there is no retreat. So from day one, Singapore's leaders decided their foreign policy would not be about ideology or morality, but about managing risk. Singapore's first-generation leaders described their country as a small asteroid surrounded by multiple suns. If there's only one sun, the asteroid will get pulled in and burned. If there are many suns, their gravitational forces cancel each other out, and the asteroid survives. That's the logic. In practice, it has turned into a very specific strategy. Economically, Singapore leans heavily toward China. As China is one of its biggest trading partners, Singapore benefits from China's growth, positioning itself as a financial and logistics hub for Chinese capital. Politically and militarily, Singapore leans toward the United States. U.S. forces rotate through Singapore, which supports a continued U.S. military presence in Asia, and aligns closely with U.S.-led security frameworks. This dual-track approach has worked for decades. Singapore made money from China, got protection from the U.S., and avoided choosing sides. But that balancing act only works when tensions are manageable. And that's where the problem starts. Why does Singapore panic when China and Japan clash, then? When China and Japan confront each other, Singapore feels something most outsiders don't: existential anxiety. Not ideological anxiety. Not moral anxiety. But economic survival anxiety. Singapore sits at the eastern entrance to the Malacca Strait, one of the world's most important maritime choke points. A large share of global trade passes through those waters, including energy shipments, container traffic, raw materials, and finished goods. If regional tensions escalate into real conflict, especially involving naval forces, Singapore's entire economic model is at risk. Ports don't function in chaos. Shipping insurance skyrockets. Trade reroutes. Confidence disappears. So when Singapore sees China and Japan drifting toward confrontation, its instinct isn't to judge who's right or wrong. Its instinct is, please stop before this ruins everything. That's why Singapore rushed out with a cool down message. But here's the mistake. Singapore misread the nature of the conflict. Singapore treated the China-Japan crisis as just another diplomatic misunderstanding. It thinks the issue can be solved by toning down rhetoric, avoiding emotional language, and, as its PM says, setting history aside. That approach worked for Singapore's own history with Japan. Japan occupied Singapore during World War II. There were massacres. There was brutality. But after independence, Singapore made a conscious decision. Forget the past. Work with Japan. Focus on development. From Singapore's point of view, that worked beautifully. So its leaders assumed, if we can do it, why can't China? That is where the misjudgment becomes serious. For China, the issue is not just history. It's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and core national interests. Recent statements by senior Japanese politicians didn't just look to the past, they also addressed Taiwan, military intervention, and collective self-defense. From China's perspective, that's not a historical debate. That's a direct challenge. When Singapore tells China to move forward, while staying silent about those provocations, it doesn't look neutral. It looks like selective neutrality. Or worse, taking sides while pretending not to. That's why the backlash was so intense. So why did Singapore think it could get away with this? There are three main reasons. First, it believes China will restrain itself. Singapore's leaders believe China is a rational, long-term thinker that values regional stability. They assume Beijing will swallow the insult, absorb the criticism, and avoid escalation for the sake of the bigger picture. That assumption has often been true in the past. But relying on it too much becomes dangerous. Second, Singapore often speaks as if it represents Southeast Asia as a whole. But that region is not unified between China and Japan. Some countries lean closer to China. Some hedge. Some lean toward the US and Japan. Singapore wrapped its own position in regional consensus language, but that consensus doesn't really exist. That weakens its credibility. Third, Singapore overestimates its diplomatic skill. Singapore has a reputation for being smart, disciplined, and effective in diplomacy. Sometimes that reputation turns into overconfidence. That is also why many Singaporeans believe they outsmart other Chinese people. This time, Singapore believed it could calm China, encourage Japan, impress Western audiences, and strengthen its leadership image in Southeast Asia. Ironically, the very thing Singapore fears most may now be closer. If tensions keep rising, balancing becomes harder. At some point, silence looks like consent, neutrality looks like weakness, and hedging looks like opportunism. Nowadays, great powers start demanding clarity. And China is the one that hates ambiguity the most. Singapore does not want to choose between its economic lifeline with China and its security umbrella by the US. But speaking carelessly increases that risk. Singapore's PM praised Japan, but he avoided directly criticizing its militarization, revisionist rhetoric, and symbolic provocations. It is the main reason why Singapore's comments angered many people. By framing the issue as less severe, and as both sides need to cool down, Singapore blurred responsibility. In conflicts involving power asymmetry or sensitive sovereignty issues, that framing rarely satisfies anyone. Taiwan is China's internal affair, and Tokyo says it might intervene militarily if something happens there. For Beijing, Sunai Takaichi's remarks are too provocative, violating the One China principle and reminding Beijing of Taiwan's colonization humiliation between 1895 and 1945. Southeast Asian countries do not seem to have a united front. Despite what some speeches suggest, Southeast Asia is deeply divided on regional security. Some are comfortable with Japan playing a larger role. Others are cautious. Some are openly skeptical. The PM of Singapore believes he could represent all Southeast Asian countries and people, but he is wrong. He can only represent himself, not anyone else. Why does his speech matter beyond Singapore, then? Because what he said isn't just a speech. It's about how small and middle powers behave in an era of intensifying great power rivalry. For decades, globalization allowed countries to trade with everyone, avoid hard choices, and separate economics from security, but that era is fading. Today, ambiguity carries higher costs. Singapore's move shows what happens when old balancing strategies meet new geopolitical realities. We must admit Singapore's new PM did not mean to anger China, so Beijing did not overreact to his remarks. Despite some online commentary and social media discussions, there have been no official Chinese government announcements imposing restrictions or economic measures, nor have any formal protests targeted Singapore specifically in response to the Prime Minister's remarks on China-Japan tensions. Analysts and available reporting do not indicate that China is downgrading relations, halting cooperation, or issuing démarches specifically tied to this issue. While China's government did not take clear punitive action, Chinese social media reacted strongly. Many netizens expressed outrage or frustration over Singapore's position, accusing it of interfering in major power diplomacy or taking sides. That has been visible in trending discussions online rather than in official governmental steps. China and Singapore maintained engagement. Before the recent controversy, China's leadership, including Premier Li Qiang and President Xi Jinping, met with Singapore's Prime Minister and emphasized cooperation, mutual interests, and a long-standing partnership, including celebrations of 35 years of diplomatic relations. Those ties remain active despite occasional disagreements. Lawrence Wong's words are not intervention but persuasion. He wasn't malicious. And he wasn't stupid. But his stance was risky. He treated a deep strategic confrontation as a diplomatic misunderstanding. He underestimated how resolutely China would handle sensitive core interests regarding Taiwan. And he also overestimated how much moral authority a small state has when speaking to major powers. Sometimes, knowing when to keep silent is wisdom. And sometimes, the urge to manage others reveals more about your own fears than about their mistakes. That's the real story behind why Singapore dared to speak, and why the online reaction was so fierce. Lawrence Wong might be too young, too simple, but Lee Hsien Loong, Singapore's senior minister, stated that he does not support any change to the status quo regarding Taiwan. Singapore is too small to exert military pressure on China. If it could, Lee Hsien Loong would also have made clear his intention to militarily intervene in China's reunification, just as Sanai Takaichi did.
There are many things which people have views of what it is doing, but on Taiwan, I don't think they have been doing wrong things recently.
Who gave him the guts to do that? His father, Lee Kuan Yew, argued that Taiwan's unification with Beijing was inevitable in the long term, even when China could not compete militarily with the US. Now, with China's rapid rise militarily and economically, even Trump says it is up to Chinese President Xi Jinping to decide how to resolve the Taiwan issue. How can Lee Hsien Loong dare to warn Beijing not to change the status quo across the Taiwan Strait? Who stands behind Lawrence Wong and Lee Hsien Loong when they lecture Beijing? Most Singaporeans are Chinese, but many of them regard themselves as superior, reluctant to recognize the connection, even when Americans insist that they are.
So, you said today, as you often say, that you live in Singapore. Of what nation are you a citizen?
Singapore.
Are you a citizen of any other nation?
No, Senator.
Have you ever applied for Chinese citizenship?
Senator, I served my nation in Singapore. No, I did not.
Do you have a Singaporean passport?
Yes, and I served my military for two and a half years in Singapore.
Do you have any other passports from any other nations?
No, Senator.
Your wife is an American citizen, your children are American citizens.
That's correct.
Have you ever applied for American citizenship?
No, not yet.
Okay. Have you ever been a member of the Chinese Communist Party?
Senator, I'm Singaporean. No.
Have you ever been associated or affiliated with the Chinese Communist Party?
No, Senator. Again, I'm
Okay.
Singaporean.
Let me ask you some hopefully simple.
But when they talk about Taiwan and Japan, they believe they can freely express their opinions on behalf of the people who have the same faces as theirs. Especially when addressing Western audiences, who cannot distinguish a Singaporean from a Chinese, Japanese or Korean, they feel they can play the victim role and forgive the atrocities committed nearly a century ago and move forward with the grandkids of invaders, even if they are trying to revive their grandpa's militarism, threatening East Asia again. Viewers may wonder why the Chinese government can tolerate their rhetoric and does not fight back and impose sanctions on Singapore as it has done to Japan. The answer is simple. China is not the US and President Xi Jinping is not Trump, and Singapore will not become the second Venezuela. Both Lawrence Wong and Lee Hsien Loong know this, so they are relaxed when lecturing Beijing on respecting the status quo and moving forward, setting history aside. They feel safe beside China, although it is a superpower equal to the US on most fronts. We do not think it is a pity that the Chinese leaders are too soft on those righteous-looking banana republic politicians, even if they represent the interests of a handful of elites across the Pacific Ocean. Chinese netizens in the Greater China area, including the Chinese mainland, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Malaysia, Indonesia, and even Singapore itself, do not keep silent and share their anger online toward their remarks over Taiwan and Japan. It is more than enough. Beijing does not have to say a bad word about Singapore, and there is no need to punish it like sanctioning Japan. In reality, Singapore has become another Lithuania in the eyes of Chinese people around the world, and even people with Chinese blood in Singapore do not agree with their PM and SM, saying they cannot represent them. They do not want to move forward, setting history aside.